guys, welcome back. This is MacChat episode number 91, featuring the third and final part of my interview with Interplay founder, Mr. Brian Fargo. In this segment, we'll talk a little bit about the fall of Interplay, what led to Interplay's demise. We'll talk about development in the 80s and 90s versus today. We'll also hear from Brian about his upcoming Hunted game, and much more. So, without further ado, here is Mr. Brian Fargo.
You know, one thing I was kind of wondering, reading about some of your comments, there's a comment here about how in the late 80s and early 90s there was a lot of creativity, but then as it got to the early part of the 21st century, that creativity was being sucked out. You know, and it seemed to be in the context of the consoles. You know, now there's this big shift to console gaming. And I was sort of wondering if maybe that had something to do with the fact that you know, all the classics we were talking about were computers. You know, you'd mentioned the Commodore 64, and I was just wondering if the gamers then just had more savvy, more tech savvy. They were maybe more patient with stuff than console gamers are. I mean, is there any truth to that idea?
I think the biggest issue is that you know, it's really the cost of making these games, right? So if you go to the mid '90s, even, right, like Descent, it was done by a couple of guys. You know, I think the budget on that was like $300,000. So you could reasonably expect 2 or 3 guys to forgo their salary or get their friends or put together a pretty good sample of that for 6 figures, right, and get it out and shop it and try some innovative stuff. As games started going up higher, higher, and higher, that breed of person disappeared. There was nowhere for them to go except to get a job. Okay, so now you're just at a job, you know, you're working on big projects, you're pulling tasks off the wall. There was no commerce, there was no opportunity to sell, not on a realistic basis. There wasn't enough, right? But then all of a sudden, here comes Flash, here comes iTunes. You know, I look at today's environment creatively like it was in the late 80s, early 90s. I actually think we've finally come full circle, but I think there was a gap there. Where were you going to go? You know, because short of getting a job, and if you were 2 guys that had no prior experience, no publisher was going to give you the $5 million to go make a game as a first try, because they had established developers, either like myself, right? I'm still trying to get those same budgets, or they have their own, you know, they bought all these companies that got a lot of mouths to feed and they got to keep them busy, right? So that, it just made it so there was a hole for no creative guy to actually do something and have the ability to make a dime from it, you know, and now that's all changed.
World of Goo and so on.
Exactly. Perfect examples.
Now I think you used the word tallest midget to describe, you know, Interplay during this trend. It must have been a really tough time, you know, in Interplay.
Yeah.
You know, I can only imagine it just must have been a depressing time for you.
Well, you know, it was, certainly there were hard times, you know, towards the end. You know, it was frustrating, right? I mean, there's always this, there's 2 schools of thought, all right? One school of thought says, stick with what you know, right? Stick with what you know to your tenants, right? The other school's, who moved my cheese, right? Move with the times, right? And so, you know, we were, you know, we did great on the PC side of the business, right? I mean, there was not many companies can look back and point to as many franchises that we helped create in a pretty short period of time under the budgets. You know, we never had the resources that the EAs of the world had. And so we did great stuff, right? Redneck Rampage, Kingpin, Descent, Battle Chess, Fallout. I mean, you know, the list goes on and on. We got a lot of great stuff. But the PC business was just being killed by console. So here's the console world, and we just were out of cycle, right? Like, because it takes a couple of years to get up to speed, and so we couldn't just throw everybody on it, because that cycle, we would have been at the very end as it was going down, and you would have had to wait for the next one, and we were too early for that, you know, and that's why we did the Shiny acquisition, right? Really was like, okay, if we don't get onto this console business to some degree, you know, we're going to find ourselves in trouble. Of course, I bought Shiny, and then they worked on Wild 9 for 3 years, and boom, that was pretty much, you know, it's not just them, don't get me wrong, but that, you know, that was supposed to be our big bet to get into the console. And so, you know, that's why, you know, world's tallest midget. So the PC business is just going like this, and, you know, here we are, top 5, top 6, but it's not, we're not making money at that, you know, and a lot of it And hey, we made our mistakes. Don't get me wrong. But a lot of people's success, you can kind of point to a title that really, changed it for them. THQ wrestling, man, you got that 4 or 5 million seller. Activision, Tony Hawk, right? Take Two, it was Grand Theft Auto, right? You could point to like this one title. I mean, EA had sports and other things. They were kind of all into themselves, but a lot of the remaining players had that one big seminal product that kept them and made them alive. We didn't really have it. The closest thing we had was Baldur's Gate, but there were three issues with that. PC hits were not as big as console hit, and we had a heavy royalty load to BioWare and TSR to boot. If we had no royalties to TSR and BioWare, might have been a different world, right? But that is, and not a complaint, but that was the reality. So we didn't have that kind of unfettered console success that could really push us over the top. So that we just weren't able to make that transition. So frustrating, but that's okay.
I was just thinking with the rise of consoles, and obviously graphics and things like that have improved over time. But have you noticed an evolution in gameplay?
Well, evolution in gameplay. Well, I mean the styles of games are so different. People's attention spans, I think, are shorter. They're willing to put time in and lose time. I gave you the example earlier, dying after an engine. You better have a lot of save points. You got to do a lot of things. People don't have a lot of time. There's a lot of different distractions now than there used to be. So we have to be more sort of cognizant of that. So I think from that standpoint, the kind of the time investment, and then this whole kind of Call of Duty phenomena now, it's become where some games are almost like sports. Like I do football, I do volleyball, I do Call of Duty. It's like a high school thing. Everybody plays it. They all have a reference point for it, and so that makes some interesting dynamics too.
Well, maybe I should just ask if there was a year, perhaps, that you thought was the sort of the golden year of computer role playing games, let's say, or the one title that just really, it's not going to get better than this, and it still hasn't.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
I'm accepting graphics and things of that sort. So just, as far as just
yeah. Gosh, it's so hard for me to choose. To me, there was a period of time where we had Fallout 2. Icewind Dale was one of my absolute favorite RPGs. I loved it more than Baldur's Gate 2 for that matter, because it wasn't overindulged in terms of the number of spells and things like that. To me, there was kind of a short period of time where I was just absolutely loving those experiences. I can remember the music now as I sit here and sitting there all night and playing those things. So to me, it was like kind of like late 90s. Sort of seems like the kind of the golden age of BioWare was also still doing work for us at the time. So I'd say right around that time there were several products that really, I think, didn't get any better.
You said Icewind Dale was your favorite of all?
One of that whole kind of product series, Fallout, for sure. But in terms of the Baldur's Gate 2, Torment, there was a magic to Icewind Dale that I really liked. There was kind of a pure experience that I thought was great.
I know you're doing this hunted game right now, so I've seen people have compared that to Gears of War, and I was wondering, what are your predictions about that game?
I predict it'll be a huge success, of course.
What is it about Hunted that has you most excited?
The thing about the product is that it's about execution, right? It is that product, right? Because there aren't a lot of co-op games. To me, that's one of the things that I think has been missing. How many games can I sit down with my friend, my wife, and whatever, right, and play these products together, side by side, start to finish, and go through the entire thing together? When you start thinking about it, you run out. The number gets pretty low pretty quick, and I think that ours is about, like, you've heard of co-op before, you've heard of fantasy before, you've heard of action before, so it's not like you haven't heard. But we put all of these things together in a great package, and we've executed really well, and I think that's what it represents more than anything.
All right, so just to finish up here, is there any? I always ask people, what is the advice you would give somebody who was a young student, maybe in high school, or maybe a college freshman who wants to get into the games industry, wants a career? What impresses you, when you interview people? What kind of things do you look for? What do you like to see?
Well, I guess what impresses me is certainly anybody that tells me something I don't know, right? And so in two ways, like if there's a particular category that somebody really likes, I don't care whether it's role playing or strategy games or whatever it is, know the category cold, okay? You can't come in and talk to because my guys all play these games too. So if you come in and start talking about game design or this or that, and you're not even up to speed on the products in the category, you know, come back when you're done, right? So I mean, you got to know everything about everything. You can't know about every product; it's impossible. But if it's role playing or whatever, you better, have put a lot of hours into those things. I look for that. The other thing is it depending on what job you're looking for if you want to get into the business too, right? So obviously, if you're a programmer, a little bit different. That's a whole other thing. So would you say that? I'm assuming you mean somebody who wants to get in the business, be like a producer or a designer when you ask that question. And so I guess the other part of it, beyond knowing a category, even if you're going to a company that doesn't do role playing games, at least know a category cold, right? Because at least they'll be impressed by your knowledge base upon something. Is obviously passion. So with passion backed up by knowledge, which is what that represents, and then know a little bit about a lot of things. Also, I mean, in terms of music, musical scoring, writing, movie pacing, know something, that when they score, think about the psychology of how they score a soundtrack to a film, or the way they do Foley sound effects, or the way kind of motion capture works, or facial technology, and why was Avatar innovative? What was it? Why do people say that? There must be a reason. How does 3D televisions work? What's stereoscopic versus blue and red screen? Just know a little bit about the world and how entertainment works, and so because you'll find yourself applying those kinds of lessons, and it makes you think broader about what you're going to do. So those would be my words of advice.
And that's all for this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Not quite sure what I'll be up to next week. Maybe another interview, or maybe one of those retro gaming retrospectives I know a lot of you have been waiting very patiently, and in some cases not so patiently for. Also want to thank everybody who has donated and contributed to the show. It's been really great. Been able to keep my rather excellent drinking horn filled with some rather excellent beverages. Matter of fact, I'll be toasting you this week with Jubilee. This is a festive winter ale from the Deschutes Brewery in Oregon. It came highly recommended. I'm looking forward to trying that out. Also want to draw your attention to armchairarcade.com. Very soon now we should be releasing the next episode of Armchair Arcade Radio. It's got a lot of great segments, including one this time from the Rampant Coyote, Jay Barnson, who some of you may be familiar with if you study his blog. He's got some great material about CRPGs, so definitely stay tuned for that. As I'm wont to do, I thought I would leave you with a quotation, this time from the great Will Rogers. And tell me if you don't think this is an appropriate quote to end this series of interviews with Mr. Brian Fargo. If you're riding ahead of the herd, take a look back every now and then to make sure it's still there. See you guys next week.